I think Ambrose of Milan is often in the shadow of his successor, or his student, and then the bright light of Christian theology, at least in the West, Augustine of Hippo. There are reams of pages on Augustine, more and more coming out every year. And in that emphasis, this figure of Ambrose, who is monumental in his day and has a huge impact on the tradition of Christian theology and on Western thought, broadly speaking, issues of church and state, issues of worship, issues of biblical exegesis, is often lost. So part of my interest in Ambrose was to bring him a bit out of the shadows. Not that there are plenty of others who do the same thing. There might even be an Ambrose industry, but it's often overshadowed, and I think he really deserves attention in his own right. Second, one kind of particular interest I have always had in Ambrose is that he is a bridge figure in many ways between the Greek-speaking Eastern Christian world of his day and the Latin-speaking Western Christian world of his time. So he was instrumental in translating a lot of works from Greek into Latin and making the wisdom that was really more mature at that point in the Greek East than it was in the Roman or the Latin-speaking West, available to broad audiences in northern Italy, in Africa, in all these different regions of the empire. And so I find him helpful in that respect because he does help to overcome some of the divides that we sometimes encounter between a Greek-speaking world and a Latin-speaking world, or between East and West. And third, Ambrose in particular has I find a kind of accessibility that we don't often encounter in the ancient world. He often is interested in just practical matters. How do you get people to understand the Bible? How do you present the liturgy, the rituals of the Christian faith to an entirely unlettered and often unfamiliar audience? Big crowds were becoming Christians. And how do we deal with our place in society, with a government that has only recently become Christian? So for all these reasons, he brings very interesting perspectives on early Christianity and has relevance today, I think. As I hinted in my previous answer, there was a real upsurge in interest in Christianity in his time. Now, one of the major events of recent memory in Ambrose's day is the conversion which is understood in many ways of the empire, and the conversion to Christianity of the emperor, first Constantine and then his successors. And this transformation had obvious and profound impacts on the life of Christians on the ground level. Suddenly they weren't, to some degree or another, an underground church. And then little by little, they were becoming an official faith. And this is over a rapid span of, or a very brief span of years. They rise rapidly from being persecuted to being authorities. And this brings a transformation in their self-consciousness and how they learn to engage the society around them and the different cultures they encounter. So that's very important for understanding Ambrose's project, how to respond to this huge influx of Christians and this new authority that Christians had. At the same time, the period after Constantine's conversion was hardly peaceful or tranquil for the Christians. In fact, it marked the beginning of many controversies that had not been engaged because they didn't have time or the energy or the focus. So suddenly they could turn inward and say, well, what is it that we really believe? And this gave rise to all sorts of internal theological controversies, issues of jurisdiction within the church that brought about new hostilities and new tensions in Ambrose's day. I think these two factors are important for understanding what he's coming out of, because it also brings us to Ambrose's time when some of those issues begin to be settled. There is a new self-confidence in Ambrose that we don't encounter in earlier sources, and so he can begin to build up something like a Christian culture in his day that we find evidenced in his hymns and his poems, I like to call them. This title that Ambrose is the father of church hymnody, while wildly exaggerated, there had been Christian hymn writers probably from the time of Jesus, does point at a real innovation in the project of hymn writing for Ambrose. There are certainly precedents, and there's certainly a wealth of evidence that Christians in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century were singing songs in common and singing those songs to God as hymns. But something about those hymns was almost always exclusively biblical. Now, I don't want to speak too broadly, but the Christian community of the first 3 centuries was especially interested in singing the Psalms and singing the poems that we find in the Old Testament in common. There are hints of original compositions, especially in small groups of Christians in different areas around the empire, but there's nothing really binding all Christians together until we reach the 4th century. And in Ambrose's time, we find that hymns become more and more, as we'll talk about, I hope, a bit more, issues of contention. They are points of developing self-identity as Christians, but also points where we express our deepest faith. What hymns do is what they always do, I'd say. They can draw communities together. They can communicate certain central ideas to a broad and not necessarily educated audience. And at the same time, they can just bring plain old delight, plain old pleasure in sharing musically in the faith that the community professes. Ambrose's hymns in particular are distinctive because they in many ways move beyond a purely, you might say, propositional understanding of hymns as giving us a bunch of teachings to endorse, or simply reciting psalmody, the words of Scripture. They mark a very sophisticated and complex engagement with all of the different influences on Christian culture in the late 4th century. So on the one hand, you do have very prominent scriptural elements in Ambrose's hymns. On the other hand, you see a very pronounced influence of classical literature, especially in the kind of meter and rhythms that Ambrose adopts and makes popular. In addition, you find the influence of his own doctrinal commitments, the concerns of the community in favor of Nicaea in the late 4th century, of Orthodox Christianity at the time. And all of these threads he weaves together in a way that hadn't been done before. This is a very interesting and central question to the project. How much are the hymns of Ambrose propaganda in a purely negative sense? Are they simply promoting an identity in response to challenges? And I don't want to exaggerate that aspect of the hymns. One of the basic points of the book is that we ought to understand creed and creed for Ambrose in a very broad sense. Creed really means what we believe, both how we believe it, and the specific propositions we profess, but also Christ. For Christians of the time, saying the word creed meant these are the things I hold, and also the way in which I hold them. So in responding to doctrinal rivals in his day, Ambrose develops these hymns not simply so that they can parrot a list of propositions that Orthodox Christians hold. And I say that because there are hymns around his time that seem to do just that. He wants, in fact, to create a hymnody that is transformative and that creates a new sensitivity in his congregation. So it's not simply a matter of saying the right words or affirming the different claims of a certain written creed, but rather to transform how they even see the world, is one of my arguments. And so it goes much deeper than mere propaganda. I do think they're trying to propagate something, but they're not trying to simply create parrots of a certain set of strict or accurate doctrines. We find in the hymns an interesting connection between his preaching to broad audiences, to all of these catechumens, all these people seeking initiation into the church, and the text of the hymns that in some ways brings these to life. They're often touching on similar themes and using similar methods for, you might say, sensitizing a congregation, but they do it with, you might say, different registers. The hymns do it by evoking the imagination, by promoting a certain, even linguistic sensitivity, a sense that words can mean many things, that images can point in many different directions, and ultimately can point to God and Christ. One example in particular I find especially endearing is his use of the figure of the rooster in talking about the morning hour. And he talks about the rooster as this central natural figure, natural symbol, in one of his homilies on the first days of creation. And he gives thanks to God for having created the cockcrow, which is not necessarily something we take intuitively. I don't think many of us would thank God for the alarm clock. But for Ambrose, it's this instrument that the Lord gives us to awaken us to natural wonder and to awaken us to the work that he gives us during the day. And that description of the cock gets transplanted to his hymn for cockcrow, which is a technical term for the 3 a.m., more or less, in the ancient world, and applied to singing a hymn to that actual natural symbol, to give thanks for the ways that the Lord has diversified the day, has given it, you might say, drama to prevent us from growing bored and from giving contours to a day. I think we see, on the one hand, how he might preach that, on the other hand, how he might have us sing that in his context. First-hand descriptions of singing hymns in the 4th century are hard to come by. We do know that they were sung liturgically. We do know that they were sung at the different hours of the day as parts of prayer that Christians were adopting as communities. We do have references to specific uses of the hymns that are quite striking and show that they maybe had a wider remit than sometimes we're expecting. Ambrose mentions the hymns only really once in his writings, and it's clear that it's connected to this kind of sit-in that he organized in the mid-380s when his community felt threatened by the empire and the military forces of the empire that was looking to, you might say, acquire one of the basilicas in Milan for a non-Orthodox type of worship. And Ambrose, in response, gathers all his people and has them sing his hymns, not just at 1 hour of the day, but all the way through the night, to keep them awake and alert, to keep them fortified, in a sense, to keep them kind of engaged, even as we're under attack or under threat. So he saw the hymns as really rallying the community. On the other hand, we see that they were used in many other contexts. The one other reference that comes to mind is when St. Augustine, Ambrose's student and then later Bishop of Hippo and then great theologian himself, talks about being at a gathering of philosophers, of very educated theologians in the late 380s. And in the course of their conversation, they're debating the immortality of the soul, what is the identity of God, how language works, all these quite sophisticated issues. His mother, Monica, who's present at the gathering, starts to sing one of Ambrose's hymns. So she introduces, I don't want to say popular piety, but something from common life, from common worship, into a conversation that we would otherwise identify as elite or exclusive. And so it shows that very quickly his hymns were everywhere and in virtually every context of Christian life in his day. I think I have two answers in mind in engaging, or two motives, I should say, in mind in using this term in my title and then throughout the study itself. And the first motive is Ambrose himself. At one point, he's writing about his hymns, one of the few points that he really reflects on them. And he says that other leaders, his opponents, are accusing him of using a trick for rallying Christians. They accuse him of seducing the crowds with charms, with chants, the way we might think of somebody as seducing an audience through a jingle or some kind of pop song. And they're accusing him of kind of a cheap trick. And he says, well, chants, enchantment, is in fact my goal. And there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, what can be greater than encouraging a congregation to chant the Trinity, to chant to God? So he seems to see enchantment as a lofty goal. And by that he means, I think, a transformation that awakens us to something more than the material, something more than the mundane, and alerts us to higher spiritual resonances, to both Scripture and to nature and to figures of holiness in his time. So I think he gives us a motive for employing this term. Now, at the same time, it is a kind of fashionable term, both in scholarship today and in certain figures who reflect on the history of disenchantment in the Western world. That is, a loss of a sensitivity to, you might say, spiritual causes at work in the world, and a move to identify all causal factors with what the natural sciences tell us are the causes. And I think other thinkers have said, well, how does one achieve, or how does one become enchanted? I think there is some parallel there between the way Ambrose saw himself as bringing his congregation a new sensitivity, and theologians today, or philosophers who see the loss of another type of sensitivity as detrimental to our engagement with the world as we encounter it. And so I think from both perspectives, the term enchantment, well, I don't want to overuse it. It can serve a very helpful function in drawing Ambrose into conversation with present-day concerns. I confess that these portions of the study are perhaps the most remote and least engaging for a lay audience, but they really reflect the state of the question in studies of the hymns for the past 200 years. Scholars have long wondered which of this corpus of Ambrosian hymns really date back to Ambrose. And there are a range of opinions. Some are minimalist. They say immediately Ambrose was being copied and imitated to such an extent that we cannot link certain texts back to Ambrose. Others are maximalist. They look at ancient manuscripts that identify certain hymns as hymns of Ambrose and say, therefore, they must be his. And always the truth, or at least the best conclusions we can draw, is somewhere in the middle, My position draws both on manuscript studies, where we look back at the early witnesses to these hymns and try to see what texts they preserve and whose authorship they note, especially when those manuscripts come from Milan, which would carry a more reliable memory of who wrote their songs. On the other hand, you have to look at issues of style, which hymns sound Ambrosian. Now, this gets very speculative very quickly and is not a very reliable criterion, but nevertheless it figures at certain points. And then we look to see who in the ancient world identifies certain texts as Ambrosian. So Augustine, for instance, names certain hymns as hymns of St. Ambrose. My stance at the end is, you might say, more to a maximalist position. I look to the major edition of the hymns, which contains 14 from a French editor, Jacques Fontaine, and I make the case that 13 of them can reliably be attributed to Ambrose. Now, there are many other Ambrosian hymns, probably over 200, and I'm not going to plead for them. But I think this is an important question to raise, and I hope that it can get people to reflect on songs in general and how, even in their performance, they're often transformed almost immediately by their audiences, which makes identifying an original intention quite difficult. I think in terms of audience, I write with scholars at least partly in mind, especially scholars of Ambrosian hymnody, where each hymn that I treat has been parsed and dissected at great length. And therefore, I know that my arguments, say defending authenticity or offering a literary and musicological analysis, have to be compelling to those who know the hymns. And that means some spade work. So I'm conscious of that kind of readership. At the same time, I wanted to offer a book, initially a dissertation, now a book, that gathered Ambrosian hymnody together and gathered scholarly reflection on the hymns together and made it accessible to an English-speaking audience. When I began to look at these hymns, I found a lacuna in that regard, that there wasn't any just book on Ambrose's hymns. There were a host of studies on ancient hymnody, on the origins of Christian singing, and a host of studies on particular hymns that Ambrose wrote. But because issues of authenticity are so thorny, and because questions of intention get so muddied, people often refrain, I think, from taking on the entire project. Which means if a junior scholar or if an undergraduate is looking for a book on Ambrose's hymns, it's hard to know where to go. And I hope that by providing this, while you might not be interested in the minutiae of authenticity, you could have access to a bibliography that promotes your research. You could have access to a general overview of a particular hymn, but you could also have access to an argument about the aims and methods of the hymns themselves. If you're simply a lay reader, you also have access to the texts of the hymns themselves, both in Latin and in English, so that you can begin to engage the sophistication of the vocabulary and the methods that Ambrose employs. In my experience, I could never have done this work without research libraries, both at my doctoral studies at Notre Dame and here at BC. They were essential for interlibrary loan, for finding books, especially in foreign languages or in other obscure presses that offer research onto the minutiae of particular hymns, because so much of the scholarship on an Ambrosian hymnody is dislocated or isolated in journals and in monographs, and not often brought together. I needed people to help track those isolated sources down for me. At the same time, one of the great homes of Ambrosian hymnody is precisely, you might say, the first research library, the Ambrosian library in Milan, certainly one of the first. And there is certainly a collaborative studying these hymns, but also very ancient hymnaries, books that contain these texts. And visiting the Ambrosian library was a real highlight in my coming to know the origins and the afterlife of these hymns in the ancient world. So I think the whole tradition of research libraries has been formative in my experience of writing this book, and now continuing to grow in my fascination with the hymns.